What's going on, everybody? This is Owen from Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. Welcome in today to episode number 49 of the program. Hard to believe that we are approaching 50 episodes. Got some exciting things planned for upcoming episodes. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. I took a little bit of a hiatus from the podcast. I have been working on doing an episode a month, and we hit the month of June, and I said, you know what, that's the middle part of the year. Let's take a little vacation for myself from the podcast, give myself a break, come up with some good ideas to do for the second half of 2026. But then June came and went, and then July came and went, and didn't really have any great ideas. Got a little busy towards the end of July, just kind of blew it off, frankly. But we're back today, episode 49. Recording today on Sunday, August 16th. Going to be doing another episode next week. The band Feel is releasing an album on this Friday, August 21st, What of Now? And I'm going to save that album review discussion for our 50th episode topic. So, what are we talking about today? Episode number 49. We are talking about one of the greatest albums of all time from one of the greatest bands of all time. It is Abbey Road by the Beatles. Lots to talk about here with this album, from, this being one of the great album covers of all time to the tracks featured on the back and everything else that goes along with that. This, of course, was the final recorded Beatles album. They did release Let It Be afterwards, but the songs were recorded prior to Abbey Road. Some kind of interesting history there that we will talk about. Also want to highlight this deluxe edition CD I picked up from my local library. It features remastered versions of the original 16-track album, Abbey Road, but it also features some of the recordings and the different takes and whatnot of each track as part of that deluxe edition. Also, just want to give a plug to your local library. It's a great way to get music physically, CDs, and even other things, books, movies, a lot of great online resources. Really been feeling my library lately, so I just want to give them a shout out. So let's talk Abbey Road. This album released on September 26th of 1969, so that makes this album over 50 years old. It'll be turning 60 here in about 3 years, right? 79, 89, 99, 09. 2019 was 50 years. 2029 will be 60 years since this album was released. As I mentioned, this was the last album recorded by the Beatles. Not the last release, but it was the last bit of music that they all recorded together. And included with this deluxe edition CD, there's a nice little booklet on the back that really has some nice excerpts about the recording process, and I'm going to read through some of those as part of today's episode. This was the 11th studio album from the Fab Four, so they had done, a lot of work. They were the biggest band in the world at the time this album was released. And for me, this album is a really triumphant finish to their catalog. I enjoy a lot of the tracks on here, and we're going to do a track-by-track breakdown of each song and just kind of, I'll give a brief little explanation of what I think about this one. A lot of people will give album rankings for the Beatles, and while I don't have that full list here today, I would say that this is my favorite album by the Beatles. A lot of people, the other contender for that slot would probably be Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And I will be honest, when I first started listening to the Beatles, just a story here about how I started to get into the Beatles. And you may think, well, who needs a story about that? They're the most famous band in the world. Well, not everybody is a Beatles fan. There are some Beatles detractors out there. Some feel maybe they're too popular or they're overrated or whatever it may be. And I was kind of in that camp for a while. I thought they're not heavy enough. I think now, here we are 50, 60 years later since the Beatles finished. Music, especially rock music, has evolved so much. Guitars have gotten louder. Sound has gotten bigger. Drums have gotten more technical. And the Beatles can kind of look elementary to a degree, at least to some people's ears. And I was in college, and I took a history of rock music course from Ohio University. I took the course. There was 2 parts to this course. So part 1 focused on rock music from 1950, and it went up to 1970, really the end of the 60s. Because once we get into the 70s, different subgenres start to occur, and music really starts to splinter out. But in this class, it was a once a week class, Monday nights, And the Beatles, so impactful that they had 2 weeks of this course dedicated to them. So the first, what they had two whole classes, which no other artist got even close to that. The first course was talking about like the early days of the Beatles, their pop music sort of time. And then the second class talks about, the latter portion of their career. And what's so interesting about the Beatles is, they stopped touring, I want to say maybe in 66, somewhere around there. And they just go entirely to being a studio band. I think from Revolver on. And they create some of the best music in their catalog, in my opinion. And they don't even have to tour to support that. You could not have, artists nowadays, touring is a big part of what they do. And especially for a band to survive and still be the biggest thing in the world without any sort of touring or live performance is truly spectacular, and it was something that the Beatles were able to accomplish. This album is obviously iconic, and as a result of history of rock music at Ohio University, I decided to give the Beatles a chance. I heard this from someone's perspective, from the professor's perspective, and it got me thinking, like, okay, maybe I have misjudged the Beatles. Maybe there is something to this. And as a result, I've talked about this on the show in the past, but I went through my process of listening to every band, to the band's entire catalog. I started with their first album, Please Please Me, went all the way through With the Beatles, Beatles for Sale, Hard Day's Night, Help, Rubber Soul. Let me see if I can get them all here. Revolver, missing some, but Sgt. Pepper's, and the White Album all the way through Abbey Road and Let It Be. And by the end, I realized once I actually listened to this with an open mind and maybe didn't just accept the opinions of those around me, that okay, the Beatles are not just, overrated. This isn't just some hype machine. This is actually some of the greatest music of all time. And that became apparent to me. So I would encourage anybody who's listening, who is not a Beatles fan or thinks the Beatles are overrated or whatever, give them a chance. And if you really don't know where to start, Abbey Road is a great starting point, I would say. You likely already know some of the songs on here, such as Come Together, Here Comes the Sun. Those are two of the more popular songs in their catalog. And the Beatles are just fun to listen to, in my opinion. And I think this is a happy album. And George Martin echoes that. And we'll read some excerpts of what he wrote and what he had said previously about working with the Beatles, particularly on Abbey Road. But I think this is just a fun album. It's a happy album. I love singing along with it, especially on that medley that we get on side 2, and we'll totally dive into all of that. This album, talking about how it was sort of made for a little bit, it was recorded at Abbey Road Studios. I do not believe at the time it was known as Abbey Road Studios. It was EMI Recording Studios. It was on the road called Abbey Road, and I'm not sure when it became known as Abbey Road Studios, but I want to say that this album played a part in sort of it being known as that. Obviously, we'll talk about the iconic cover. We'll talk about just this band is larger than life. And I think people who may not even listen to the Beatles, but they know this cover. They recognize the Beatles. And when you talk about the Beatles, Abbey Road, and the artwork, and maybe not so much the music, but the imagery of Abbey Road is synonymous with the Beatles. And it's hard to separate those two and to think about the Beatles without thinking of Abbey Road. Talking about the cover art, it lacked any sort of band name, any sort of album title. It was just a picture, them crossing the street. And that was kind of rare at the time. That was a first for the Beatles catalog. They had not done something like that before. So it just shows, the Beatles are really known for innovation and kind of pushing the envelope and trying new things. Here again, in a not even musical capacity, this is just album art. They're trying new things. And I think that's a really neat thing for an artist to do, especially, 11th studio album. They could just kind of say, all right, we got a formula. We're going to just follow the formula, write some songs, write a dozen or so songs and just churn it out. But no, they're going to try and innovate and evolve. And that's what makes the Beatles so special. Not that other bands don't do that, but I think the Beatles do that especially well. This album had tremendous success commercially. We'll talk about some of the critical reception. There were some mixed reviews to Abbey Road initially, but in the US, for example, this album peaked at number 1 for 11 weeks, and it stayed in the top 100, or it might be I think it's the top 200 for albums. It stayed in the Billboard charts for 83 weeks. So that's, almost 2 years worth of time that this album was charting. And even today, I don't have like exact numbers on this, but I would imagine it's one of the most printed albums in terms of like if we're talking vinyl pressings or even CDs. I imagine this album still flies off shelves and is still sold at everywhere, and not just record stores. You go into like a books and company or any sort of maybe some little store in the mall like that. They're going to have Abbey Road there if they sell records. But talking about sort of, this is a larger than life album. The production of this album, there's a quote from George Harrison I heard while kind of doing research for this. He says, "We felt like we were reaching the end of the line." And, Ringo had kind of said to counter that point. No, there wasn't like, this is the last album, last song, last take. Like, that wasn't really a focus, but there was some tension during the production of this album, more so the production of Let It Be. That had kind of been recorded. This is 1969, so this was recorded early 69. They're kind of recording some Let It Be stuff. A lot of tension during that, and it wasn't clear if the band was going to make it. In fact, George Harrison actually quits the band, and their future is kind of up in the air. Nobody knows, and it's kind of scuttlebutt is going around the scene. Are the Beatles going to break up? They're the biggest band in music at that time. And they kind of take a break. They regroup. The summer of 69, they get back, sort of record Abbey Road. It's a drawn out process. It's not something they recorded in 3 weeks or anything crazy like that. It took them a couple months. But by September, they had it at a point where they were satisfied, and they ended up, releasing the album. The album, to me, I've kind of touched on this earlier, mentioned this. It has a triumphant feel to it, especially the last track on the album, The End. I think just musically and the message of that, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And I think that is sort of ties into the Beatles. A lot of people associate the Beatles with, they're just a bunch of hippies. But I think there's so much more than that. And I think that's a really like reductionist viewpoint of the Beatles. But yeah, they're on the edge of falling out. And some bands, when it gets to the end, there's just fizzles. And the Beatles are so interesting because, this is 1969. These guys, I want to say they were all under 30 years old. I think Ringo is the oldest. He was 29 when this album was made. And they come on the scene in 1963, 6 years prior. So they're from their 20s, they have made such a large impact. And a lot of bands, they might go on for decades now, and they'll have tours where they're all fat, they're all old, they don't sound nearly as good as they once did. They don't really put out recorded music anymore. They can just kind of rest on their laurels and just play those few hits once a year, once a summer for touring. And then they go back and they do an album, and it might sound okay, but it's nothing like what they initially did. Without naming any names, I'm sure we can all think of a band that fits that profile. And the last album, maybe not being their most triumphant, or they kind of fizzle. The Beatles don't have that. We can talk about Abbey Road or Let It Be, the album that comes after this in terms of chronological release, and not everybody loves that one as much. I think Abbey Road is good, and it still has some moments. I mean, it gave us Let It Be. It gave us songs like Two of Us, Across the Universe. Some George Harrison fans would say, okay, they could have included more George Harrison representation. And, he goes on to, a few years after, do an album called All Things Must Pass, which many regard as one of the best Beatles solo albums, and I would certainly agree that it's one of the best, maybe the best. We can talk Beatles solo albums in another episode for sure, but the Beatles, even up to the end, were able to create excellence. And I think Abbey Road is an example of excellence. And they're able to create this, the band, there's tension, this and that, but they're able to push that aside and still focus up and make good music. And, maybe this is just a product of the times, but as I mentioned, nowadays, let's take Motley Crue, for example. They've been going for 40 years. A lot of people ridicule them online for videos of their live performances, and it's just not what they used to be. We got to see the Beatles age, but they weren't aging as the Beatles. They were aging as former Beatles. Paul McCartney just released an album earlier this year. Ringo Starr has played shows within the last decade. And, John Lennon, obviously, his career was cut short, so we never really know what he would have been doing after 1980. And George Harrison, he went on to create more music into the 80s. In fact, he had the last number one hit made by a Beatle with I Got My Mind Set on You. I believe that came out in 1988. And, they didn't age as the Beatles. They aged separately. And it's kind of rare now for a band to sort of to split. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that might seem rare. Bands aren't as popular as they once were. A lot of the popular bands are older bands who are established, who've been on the scene for decades at this point. And once a band reaches a certain point in their tenure, they really aren't going to break up. There's not a lot that can happen that can cause sort of split like that. I guess Bon Jovi could be an exception if we think about Richie Sambora leaving the band, within the last several years. That was kind of a shock. But, the Beatles to kind of quit when they did probably is a good thing to help preserving their legacy. But we don't get to see them age kind of and fall off. They get to sort of ride off into the sunset on a high note. And Abbey Road delivers that. So yeah, this is a highly successful album, 12 times platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America, the RIAA. 12 times platinum. This was certified in 2001, so that was 25 years ago. So I imagine they've sold more copies since. But 12 times platinum, for those of you who don't know, that is the same as 12 million copies. So quite the amount of sales here. I want to read here an excerpt from the deluxe edition CD 2-pack that I picked up from my local library. This is an excerpt titled The Route to Abbey Road. This sort of tells the story of how we came to get to Abbey Road and how this came to be with the drama of the Let It Be sessions, and just sort of encapsulates it in a good way, better than I could put. So I'm just going to read this for you guys here. So this is The Route to Abbey Road. In terms of its enormous popularity and musical ingenuity, Abbey Road challenges the status of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band as the group's greatest achievement. But who might have predicted that when the new year of 1969 dawned? Operating within a fertile music business, the Beatles knew they must maintain their work rate and keep making records. In a music scene undergoing seismic changes, many of the Beatles' early contemporaries had reached a peak and fallen by the wayside. Excitingly, 2 weeks before the release of the White Album in November 1968, it was announced that the group would play 3 concerts at the Roundhouse in London during mid-December. A 1-hour TV spectacular may be built around the shows. As it had been more than 2 years since their last live performance, this was startling news. The Beatles' new album is the incredible achievement of 5 months' work, an Apple executive told the press. They naturally plan to center their appearance around these 30 tracks. That's referencing the White Album, obviously. Plans, however, were soon modified. By the time the group gathered on the soundstage at Twickenham Film Studios on the 2nd of January 1969, the idea of a televised live concert had become even more adventurous. Still number 1 in the UK, USA, and many other countries, the White Album was hardly old news. Yet they abandoned the idea of playing anything from it, choosing instead to learn a set list of new songs. We'll probably write some fast ones here together, John told producer George Martin on the first day of rehearsals. With a provisional date for the concert now scheduled for the 20th of January 1969, that was particularly ambitious, even for the Beatles. As Paul said in 1969, when we came to do it, we said, we'll write new songs because we've always wanted to keep ahead of ourselves. We're bored immediately. Furthermore, it had been decided to film all their rehearsals so that viewers might trace the evolution of each song. Really to see a work in progress was the idea, Paul recalled. Just to see something from the absolute first little seed of the idea brought through to fruition. And then we were going to play it all in glorious technicolor. As the climax of the project was a return to live performance, the group imposed a rule that no studio effects and overdubbing could be considered for the arrangements of the songs. Engineer Glenn Johns, who had worked regularly with the Rolling Stones, balanced the sound. Encircled by cameras, the Beatles huddled together, one moment feeling too hot from the film crew's lights, and the next too cold from the large building's wintry drafts. A detailed history of the time spent on this Get Back project eventually released in 1970 as an album and film called Let It Be, can be saved for another time. To cut to the chase, it seems to be the Twickenham rehearsals that have characterized the whole enterprise as an unhappy one, both in the minds of anyone who has watched the movie and of the Beatles. All 4 admitted that there were underlying tensions, no doubt amplified by their unfamiliar surroundings and the constant presence of cameras and microphones literally bugging them. The audio on hundreds of film sound rolls provides an invaluable historical record of these days. The Twickenham tapes, in particular, contain some candid group discussions about whether to continue as a unit. As the days ticked away at Twickenham, director Michael Lindsay Hogg's primary concern was where the proposed concert should take place. The hire of two ocean liners to take the Beatles and an audience to the Arabian desert for a torchlit concert was just one of many quixotic ideas chewed over for the televised event. On the seventh day of rehearsals, he had to cope with an even thornier problem. After an apparently cooperative morning playing Get Back and Two of Us, something happened during the lunch break that led George to announce he was quitting the group. His wonderfully understated diary entry for Friday, the 10th of January, 1969 read, "Rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home." This crisis was soon resolved. George agreed to return with two non-negotiable conditions. They would move to the cozier surroundings of their studio at Apple, and there would no longer be a live television appearance. There's that famous old saying, "You always hurt the one you love, and we always love each other." And we all know that, Ringo told the BBC the day before they regrouped. We still sort of hurt each other occasionally, and it builds up into something bigger than it ever was. Things were much sunnier at Apple, where they remained true to the original principles of recording with no studio effects and no overdubbing. The objective now was to document the group making an album in a similar way to their earliest sessions at EMI's studios. The atmosphere was brightened further by an old friend of the Beatles joining them on keyboards. They had met Billy Preston in Hamburg when he had arrived to perform with Little Richard. In London, to play with Ray Charles, Billy popped into Apple and soon found himself down in the basement for the rest of the month. Eventually, it was decided to film 2 live sequences in order to give what was now going to be a movie a suitable finale. An unannounced lunchtime concert took place on the roof of 3 Savile Row on the 30th of January, 1969. Playing into a freezing wind, the Beatles gave a 42-minute concert. It was to be their last public performance ever. Although, of course, no one knew that at the time. All that was reported in the pop paper NME was an article called "Alan Klein to Help Beatles," was a casual mention that some of the specially written songs were heard by startled passers-by in London's Savile Row last Thursday. The following day, the cameras rolled for 3 songs that were unsuitable for the open air in the Apple studio performance. While the benefits of hindsight may assume that dissatisfaction with what had been recorded in January 1969 led the Beatles to rally together to make a final triumphant musical statement, the sheen of the production and the immaculate performance on Abbey Road make it tempting to think that. But this is just speculation. While there were occasions when a divorce was mentioned in a group discussions during January, by the end of that month, the storm clouds appeared to have blown over. True, there were also a few cloud bursts in the spring of 1969, but by the summer, things seemed to have become calmer. Certainly the audio on the original Abbey Road session tapes indicate that. As George disclosed, "I didn't know at the time that it was the last Beatles record. I remember liking the record and enjoying it, but I don't recall thinking that was it, because there was so much going on all the time. There was always a possibility we could have carried on," Ringo reflected. "We weren't sitting in the studio saying, 'Last record, last track, last take.'" The recording of Abbey Road divides 2 distinct time periods. The first phase included recordings made between late February and early May of 1969. 5 of the album's songs were started in this period: "I Want You," "She's So Heavy," "Something," "Darling," "Octopus's Garden," and "You Never Give Me Your Money." It was not yet certain whether the 5 extra songs might find a home within a new project or the previous one. During these months, business dealings at Apple could be at times rather fractious. Alan Klein, who had been involved in the financial affairs of the Rolling Stones, the Animals, and Herman's Hermits in the USA, was hired to bring some order to the company. In doing so, he turned the original Apple ethos inside out. Running in parallel to Klein's hirings and firings, there was also a protracted struggle over the shareholdings in Northern Songs, the company that controlled the publishing of the Beatles' compositions. But the matter most seriously tugging at the heart of the group was the fundamental disagreement over who should be appointed to control their financial affairs. Paul remembered that the most highly charged moment caused by this occurred at Olympic Sound Studios. You Never Give Me Your Money had been recorded there on the 6th of May. 3 days later, a Friday evening, the group gathered at Olympic for further work with Glenn Johns. Alan Klein was returning to New York the next day and insisting that he must take with them a management contract for 3 years signed by all four Beatles. Paul would not sign. For some reason, the three of them were so keen to go with him that they really bullied me and ganged up on me, he remembered in his book many years from now. I said no. I want a good deal out of this guy. I'll wait until Monday before we ratify anything. My lawyer will be present on Monday. So they said, oh, fuck off. And they stormed off, leaving me with a session at Olympic. Glenn Johns was putting the finishing touches to the Steve Miller Band album Brave New World at this time. The now unwanted Beatles session was used for a collaboration between Steve Miller and Paul. He and I did a track of this called My Dark Hour, Paul recalled. I thrashed everything out on the drums. There's a surfeit of aggressive drum fills. It was a strange time in my life, and I swear I got my first gray hairs that month. Glenn's 1969 diary shows a scheduled Beatles session for the next day was canceled. 6 days after Paul's dark hour at Olympic, he was interviewed for BBC Radio. Maryside by Roy Corlett asked whether there was still a great bond of friendship between the Beatles. Paul replied, yes, sure there is. They're my three best friends. They are good lads, I tell you. Indeed, it was not always going to be this gray. The remainder of the Abbey Road LP was the result of a consistent period of work during July and August, following an extended break from recording together. The Beatles had reconvened with a clear purpose. Their previous album project was on hold until the documentary film was completed, so, in the meantime, they decided to complete a new one. George Martin was delighted to find the group had opted to return to the relatively disciplined routines of recording at EMI. Paul rang me up and said, we're going to make another record. Would you like to produce it? My immediate answer was, only if you let me produce it the way we used to, he said. We will. We want to. Everybody worked frightfully well, and that's why I'm very fond of it. It was a very happy record. For several songs, George Martin provided scores that were recorded towards the end of the sessions. He was also delighted to nurture the ambitious medley on side 2 that was known during the sessions as The Long One. Without being pretentious, the producer remembered, I thought we were making a kind of art form, and I wanted them to think symphonically. I wanted them, when writing their songs, to think in terms of first and second subjects, in symphony form and sonata form. Another key element of Abbey Road is the quality and intricacy of the harmony singing. However, for all the sophisticated production techniques in play, many of the songs do have at their core live group performances onto which overdubs were later added. We've talked about the album of Abbey Road. We've talked about its sort of standing in the world, in popular culture, how it kind of got to be made. They're talking about that fraction where they're doing what would become Let It Be, and a lot of tension there, and they just kind of said, all right, let's take a break. And they focused up on a new project, got back with George Martin. Let It Be is produced by Phil Spector, so a different production, different just sort of environment. And they kind of went back to their roots with Abbey Road. And I think maybe that's why it has sort of such a rich sound to it, and why it's kind of beloved the way that it is. Just flipping through this booklet now, making sure there's anything else I want to read. I think I will read a story about how the cover was made, but before we get into sort of that, and I might read some notes about critical reception to this record when it first came out, let's talk about the actual music on this. So this is a 16-song album. 17, there is a secret track at the end. Side 1 and side 2. Side 2 is really like a complete like track listing. There's the medley that I sort of referenced in that excerpt that I read. Those actually were meant to be flipped at first. So what you know, if you know the record, and you will after this episode, what is on side 2 was initially intended to be on side 1. And so that's why a song like I Want You, She's So Heavy ends sort of suddenly. That was meant to be the end of the album. And then, we have a song like The End and like Her Majesty, which, that's the secret track, that sort of ends so abruptly. That was meant to be switched. So they end up, putting it side 1, side 2. I think it works well the way it is. I think the end is how the album should end. I think it's fitting, and I'm glad that they kept it that way. So the album rather, opens up with "Come Together," one of the most iconic Beatles songs, one of the most popular. Michael Jackson has a cover of this one. Really adds some funk to it. Really adds some just like slightly different instrumentation. It's a fun rendition. I really like Ringo's playing on this, not just this song, but I think on this album as a whole, Ringo really steps it up a notch. Ringo has a lot of detractors because oh, he's boring. I don't know, but I think Ringo does a good job with serving the song is what he's known for. But on this record, I really like how he features his toms on his drum set, and I think he just really puts it all out there. It's kind of fitting, like it's the last one, and he leaves a statement. So I think that's great to see. And we hear it on this one. This is a John Lennon tune, written by John, sung by John. To me, a lot of this is like, what is he singing about? And I'm sure there's a deeper meaning. Admittedly, I didn't take as much time as I probably should have, looking at the lyrics. I just kind of liked to absorb the music as it hit my ear and not kind of do too much digging or too much homework or too much kind of interpretation. I could do better with that, but yeah, I just enjoy this one. Lennon was less involved with this record. He had suffered a car accident, him and Yoko, and so that kind of sidelined him. So Come Together being one of Lennon's few involvements here, but I mean, just it's inspired by a Chuck Berry song. The specific song I'm not sure of, but I had read that during my research. It's really just an iconic opening track that and then we get into that bum 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 bum. It's got some punch to it, which I like. Contrast that with the second track on the album, Something. This song is adored by many people in the music community, and it didn't take long for it to achieve that adoration. Frank Sinatra called it one of the greatest love songs of all time, and it doesn't even say "I love you" in it. Many different artists covered this track. Frank Sinatra covered it. Elvis has covered it. There are others, but this is a widely regarded song written by George Harrison. George, as I mentioned earlier, had a lot of ideas he wanted to bring to the group. And, we get that here is one of his best songs he had ever written with the Beatles, one of the best songs he's ever written. And it was towards the end. In some of this documentary, I haven't watched all these documentaries that they did towards the end of their career, but a lot of people, a lot of George Harrison fans will look and they'll see that, well, we clearly see that George is trying to bring ideas into the fold, and whether it's John or Paul, they're rejecting his ideas. And some of these songs that George would go on to do as a solo act are better than whatever the Beatles were putting out at that time, and they missed an opportunity not featuring his songs. I think there's some validity to that criticism, particularly of John and Paul not including those songs, but they did include a song like Something, and it's one of the greatest love songs ever written, and it's one of George's. It is likely, well, there's another George song on this album that I like more, but this is one of George's primary contributions to the Beatles. I like the string arrangements here. It's not uncommon for the Beatles to sort of feature those arrangements and have that sort of full developed sound. I think of a song like Eleanor Rigby. I mean, that has lovely string arrangements. But yeah, it's the first song by the Beatles that went to number one that was not written by John Lennon or Paul McCartney. So we got to give it up to George Harrison here with Something. That brings us to the next track on this album, which is Maxwell's Silver Hammer. This is really just a goofy song, in my opinion. I think it's meant to be kind of campy, kind of fun. We have like an anvil featured on the recording. The story behind this one and some of what you do see in some of that documentary footage, particularly for Let It Be, Paul, this is a Paul song. He is just demanding perfection, and the band has grown so tired of hammering this out and just working on this, and it's gotten old and just trogging through it, and they just really can't take much more. And I think this was a big friction point for the band recording this one. I had read that when they re-recorded it during the Abbey Road sessions in the summertime or whenever that was, after that January of '69 sort of debacle with the Let It Be recordings, it went much smoother, but there is still some sort of tension behind that song. Lennon was not a big fan of this one. He said it was more of Paul's granny music. That was, granny music being a common critique by Lennon for a lot of Paul's songs. I think he would even go on to say that about some of his solo records. I think I think Lennon was critical of Ram, which is an album I've been listening to a lot lately. That's a solo album from Paul McCartney. Picked that one up from Three Feather Records in Fairfield recently, and absolutely great record. But that's a little side point. We might talk about that on another episode of the show. There's some fun like synth bits throughout this whole album, but I kind of noted that on Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Again, they feature an anvil, some unique instrumentation there, but this one, not my favorite on the album. It would probably be the weakest one for me. I think every album has like a weaker leg to stand on, and while there are perfect albums, even great albums like Abbey Road still have those weak legs, and I would say that Maxwell Silverhammer is the weak leg for me. Going on to Oh Darling, I think of this one with, I read about that rooftop concert they had. I'm like 98% sure they performed this one on the rooftop, and that's what I think of. I think of John Lennon in that kind of fur coat and Paul up there singing this song, and Paul really screeching it out here. He's really wailing on these vocals on Oh Darling, and I read this. He was really trying to encapsulate that sound, and he wanted his voice to sound maybe not strained, but kind of like he had been singing this all week. He wanted, maybe the goal there was to have that like that passion or like that work and like that you get from the strain that it kind of represents. Lennon thought that based on the words and the lyrics that his voice would have been a better fit on this one. That could have been. I don't know, but I think it's good as it is, and I think that Paul's voice. I think Paul has a better voice than John, and I think that Paul has a good range, and we see him really kind of pushing that range here. And his vocal style is maybe not as clean as we hear on some other stuff, but I think it's fun. I'm trying to think of I like the song I've Got a Feeling. Paul was really wailing on that one. Oh Darling is kind of similar to that. Then we get one of the most fun songs in the Beatles' whole catalog, Octopus's Garden. This one, I love this one. This is a Ringo song. Ringo has a song on every album that he sings. He wrote this one. I believe he had a little help. There was somebody he would write songs with, but I believe George Harrison helped compose the music. So this is like a George Ringo kind of tandem piece. Ringo might have had somebody help him write the lyrics to this, but this is his vocal contribution. He's singing one. As much as I said, Maxwell Silverhammer is goofy, kind of campy. Octopus's Garden is also kind of goofy and silly, but it's in a fun way. And I think Ringo remarked, or somebody remarked, maybe one of the engineers, that like this is a song that the kids will enjoy. And I think they were aware of that, and that was part of maybe not their focus. They weren't trying to make music for kids, but they wanted everybody to be able to enjoy their music. And they were aware that a song like this will appeal to a certain audience. And I think that those fun, kind of silly songs, or not even silly, but just fun songs, are part of what the Beatles are about. They do sing about some serious stuff, but especially in their early career, like they're pop stars, and this pop music that you can sort of bebop to and sway your head back and forth to, or whatever, just kind of dance to. That's what the Beatles represent, and I think that's what we have in this one. The guitar part is really nice and bright, and I believe it was maybe during the White Album when Ringo kind of left the band for a little bit, and he was out somewhere in the ocean on a boat, and that's sort of where this one came to be. And I like just there's little punches of the chords in there, and I think that Octopus's Garden is just a fun song. It serves its purpose. I also like that Oasis has a nice little cover of this one. I believe that they've done live. So they have, because it's on Nebworth 1996. But we're not here to talk about Oasis today. Going on from Octopus's Garden, we have the track I Want You, She's So Heavy. And heavy this song is. For 1969, 1969, that's when Black Sabbath's first album came out. That's that album, Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath. A lot of people credit with being the birth of heavy metal, and that's a valid credit that people give to Sabbath. But I would say that I Want You, She's So Heavy, it has like a doom metal sort of vibe to it. The song is like 8 minutes in length. It's one of the longest Beatles songs. In fact, it's the second longest Beatles song. But this is really just a nice jam song. With the synth parts on this, it really just adds to it, and the big sort of like booming like movements between the music. And lyrically, it's so simple. John Lennon wrote this song about Yoko Ono, but it's concise. He wanted the lyrics to be concise. There's like 4 separate lyrics. It's I want you, I want you so bad. I want you so bad. You're driving me mad. I want you. She's so heavy. Like, it's just like so few phrases, but they stretch it out into like this 8 minute long jam. And some of Billy Preston's like keyboard work that he did with them is mixed in. And then there's some John parts on the synthesizer. It's just like I said, doom metal, but not so much in like a heavy sense, but just how like just sort of not galloping, but it's just like trudging through. I don't even know if that's a word, but that's how it sounds to my ears. And the fat shifts from chord to chord is epic, I wrote in my notes. And then we get that sort of like wind sound at the end with John Lennon kind of tinkering around on the synthesizer. That just sort of adds to like this eeriness, and it ends so suddenly, just cuts off. I always thought that was weird, but in my reading, in the research to this album, I learned that that is a result because that was going to be the last track of the album. So it was just going to be the end of the album. But that's just the end of side one. And we flip over to side two. When we flip over to side two, we start with Here Comes the Sun. Now, I like the Beatles. I've mentioned sort of how I got into the Beatles. But I've long loved the song Here Comes the Sun. Little story about this song. I guess not really a story. My mom and I just really like this song a lot, and I associate that with our relationship. And I like to think I have a good relationship with my mom. And, this song makes me think of her. And, I am her son, both, like in the sense of I'm her son, but I'm also like, a sunshine of her life, you could say. I think that's a nice, like way to look at it. I remember her telling me, this was before I moved away to college. I was about to leave for college, which, it's a big emotional moment for a parent. It's a big change in both their child's life. And I'm the oldest of her children. So this is like the first time she's going through that as a parent. And I'm going through this change, and she's going to be going through this change because I'm leaving, and sort of this. And my door, I think, was cracked because our cat had come into bed with me, and I was sleeping. And this was at a time in my life when I was falling asleep to music, and Here Comes the Sun was playing, and this was like within a week before I left for school. And she remembers telling me like that made her emotional in that moment because that's kind of our song, so to speak. And I think that's just a really sweet moment. And so I think very fondly of this song, and written and sung by George Harrison. So the other George Harrison contribution on this album. It's just a peaceful song. It's tranquil. It's really just, it's a nice piece that I enjoy. This, if you're looking at like streaming numbers, is the most popular Beatles song. I think it's definitely up there. It's kind of like short in length, which some people might hold against it, but I certainly, doesn't bother me. So yeah, it's just kind of bright and poppy, and it's got an uplifting message, and it's happy. And I think that's what a lot of the Beatles music represents. Then we get into the track Because. This is Lennon. This is inspired by Moonlight Sonata. Yoko was playing that on a piano, and Lennon said, play those chords backwards, or that little fuzzy on how that story goes, but something along those lines. And that led to sort of that line that you hear played by this Moog synth and this harpsichord that are featured on this track. And that's what we hear throughout. What really stands out to me on Because, and is highlighted on other songs, especially in this medley, which we're about to get to, is the three person harmony that we get between George, John, and Paul. All three of them singing, and they take that vocal harmony of the three of them and they layer it over 3 times. So it's like 9 people singing. And so you get like this celestial, like angel, almost like voices singing together with Because. And that's featured on other tracks. Both the members of the Beatles had said this was one of the harder vocal melodies for them to record. And I believe it. I think, how it sounds, you can hear the effort that they're putting into that. And I think that it's really a nice thing to enjoy. Then we get to the medley. Now, the medley is composed of You Never Give Me Your Money, Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, and The End. And then there's a little hidden track at the end, which is like 10 seconds in length. These songs flow together nicely. I think this was intended to be, strung together like this. Like I mentioned in the recording sessions, they called it the long one. This to me, I've gotten into Sgt. Pepper's more in the last year. And I'm really digging Sgt. Pepper's. And I was rethinking my Beatles album rankings. Like, man, do I maybe like Sgt. Pepper's the most? And I was legit entertaining this. But when I go back and listen to Abbey Road, this down the stretch here of these, 7 or 8 songs, whatever it is, that really just it solidifies this album as the pinnacle of the Beatles for me. And I think some critics at the time are really critical of it, but I think over time people have grown to appreciate it. And I think it's interesting to think how the band was able to take just sort of fragments of songs and sort of stitch it together to a point where it was, fluid, and it doesn't sound like choppy and jumpy. It flows together very nicely. I think it's really an interesting thing that they were able to pull off. Starting with, You Never Give Me Your Money, just the vocal performance on all these songs is awesome. But that melody that we hear, they bring it back on, what is that? Carry That Weight, right? Yes. Brings us back in Carry That Weight. But before we jump to the end of the melody or the medley, You Never Give Me Your Money, You Never Give Me Your Funny Paper, or You Only Give Me Your Funny Paper. Just sort of those lyrical things. I'm sure you could dig and find what they're talking about, but it's just like that's a nice little turn of phrase. That's a nice little lyric that they write there. Flows into Sun King, which I absolutely love. Sun King. I will play that, when I'm getting ready for bed or it's the end of the day or whatever. Or, it'll be my alarm sometimes when I'm waking up. Just I love the crickets at the beginning. I love how peaceful it sounds. And I think that's another song that has those triple layered harmonies with George, John, and Paul's voice all sort of lined up on top of one another. I think they're singing some lines in Italian there at the end. It just it adds like some sophistication, I guess, or some like, wow, this is really cool to the vibe. And then, we flow into Mean Mustard, and this is Mean Mr. Mustard. This is just kind of like a goofy John Lennon sort of one, but it's fun to sing along to. No, don't really know what he's singing about here. And then we get into Polythene Pam, and Polythene Pam sort of like builds it in some build up, and we get some greater presence of the full band. Ringo's kit is more heard than in the first little bit of that medley, and things are sort of picking up here with Polythene Pam. And then She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, based on a true story where some fangirls did break into Paul's house through his bathroom window. The window was open, and I just love Paul's voice on this one. She came in through the bathroom window. Just how it sort of jumps right into that. Like the song, if you're watching like the CD, like I guess if you're not watching the CD track change, it sort of just is tumbling down out of Polythene Pam, and then boom, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, and it's the vocals just rise above it all, and it's like this kind of, it's like we've reached this clearing, and it's this just kind of beautiful sound that we have. Then we sort of wind things back down with Golden Slumbers. Another phenomenal vocal performance by Paul McCartney here. And then moving into Carry That Weight, we get that melody that we got in You Never Give Me Your Money. We bring that back, vocals change. And then when we're talking about like Carry That Weight, what is that weight? Well, I think he's talking about the Beatles there. He's talking about, maybe whether they knew this was going to be the end or not. They knew the Beatles were going to end at some point. And this fame and just being a Beatle, they're going to carry that for a long time. And to me, that is what that reference is here. And then we get to the end. And the end is unique because it features the only drum solo that Ringo ever did with the Beatles. He's really, rocking out here. And I think that's just great. I think that is, you can hear that through a lot of Abbey Road compared to some of their previous records. But this really kind of like brings it on home. And when we get that drum solo, and what's really cool about the guitar solo that follows the drum solo, Paul starts it off, and then it goes to George, and then it goes to John. So they're taking turns with that guitar solo, and they repeat that sequence several times. And then it just has that single piano sort of just playing, and then we get that sort of phrase, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And we get that sort of winding ending, and we get that chord, that resonance at the end, and it just like, that's the end. And what a perfect ending for the Beatles album, the Beatles catalog, the Beatles career. It really sometimes gives me goosebumps. Or maybe it was just that I was sitting in front of the air conditioner earlier, but I think that it ties things together so beautifully. And I think it's a perfect end to a near perfect album, to be honest. And then we get a nice little, it kind of teases the readers, a secret track called Her Majesty, and how this one, it comes in with this big shocking chord. This was initially meant to be at the end of Mean Mr. Mustard, I think, but Paul didn't end up liking how it fit in the medley, so they scrapped it. But the engineer wanted to keep it at the end, so he threw it back on the end, and the Beatles ended up liking it just as a little sort of, a little treat, honestly, for the listener. They did something similar on Sergeant Pepper's after A Day in the Life, just sort of that sound at the end that we hear. And if you've heard Sergeant Pepper's, you know what I'm talking about. Wanted to go for like a similar vibe here with Her Majesty. And I think it's a nice little nod to the Queen, a nice little sign off. And I think it kind of, the end represents like the end of their music, right? And we have that nice resonance that I mentioned. But then Her Majesty is like, hey, we're still around. Like we're still creating music. And it's not, all is not over. And maybe that's just reading too much into it. So yeah, that's like my track by track breakdown of this album. Really, really enjoy it. I mentioned I wanted to talk about the cover. This is obviously an iconic cover. Creates a lot of conspiracy from this cover because of Paul right here. Paul has no shoes on here, and he's holding a cigarette in his right hand, but he is left-handed. So many people got a hold of that and thought, oh, Paul is dead. And then there's actually some interesting conspiracies here. So Lennon is meant to represent a religious figure at the front in all white. Ringo, I only read through this once. Ringo is meant to represent the Undertaker, maybe? Paul is the dead man because you don't need shoes when you die. And then George is the pallbearer. I don't entirely know like how that breaks down. What's funny is Paul did, I think he did a live album in the 90s called Paul is Live, and it was it was him in that same suit with a dog, and this time he has shoes on, and it's digitally imposed on that same album cover, and it's like meant to be a jab at that. But there is some conspiracies that Paul McCartney is dead, and the guy who's been running around for the last 50 years is a clone. I don't buy all that, but that's a fun little way that people have looked at this album. And I think that just shows like you don't get that kind of buzz or those kind of conspiracies if you're not impactful or recognizable to a large number of people. So I'm going to read this little excerpt about the cover here, and then we'll just put a bow on this episode of Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. So this is talking about the cover of Abbey Road. The front cover included neither the Beatles' names nor an album title, just a picture taken from a stepladder balanced upon by Ian McMillan. The photographer knew John and Yoko. He had featured Yoko in his collection of pictures, The Book of London, first published in 1966. She commissioned him to take photographs of her Indica Gallery exhibition, Unfinished Paintings, in November of that year, the event at which John and Yoko first met. He continued to photograph the couple for several of their subsequent projects. The whole idea, I must say, was Paul McCartney's, Ian McMillan recalled in 1989. A few days before the shoot, he drew a sketch of how he imagined the cover, which we executed almost exactly that day. Looking at the photographs from late morning on Friday, the 8th of August, 1969, it is striking how little traffic is on the road. Taking these shots 50 years later would have required being there at dawn's first light. Paul's wife Linda was 20 days away from giving birth to their first child together. She took the informal photos that show how very few people had gathered to watch the most famous group in the world walk across the road with no heavy-duty security in place. There was one policeman present to halt the traffic while the Beatles walked back and forth across Abbey Road, a few meters from the gates at EMI Recording Studios. 6 photographs were taken. The one eventually chosen for the cover was number 5, Macmillan remembered. It was the only one that had their legs in a perfect V formation, which is what I wanted stylistically. 4 symmetric inverted V's were formed by the Beatles as they strode purposefully to the other side. The image has been imitated and parodied many times on record sleeves and books. For the cover of their album, comprised of tunes from Abbey Road, Booker T and the MGs were photographed stepping across the street in Memphis, where the Stax Records studio was located, Macklemore Avenue. In 1988, the Red Hot Chili Peppers released their Abbey Road EP. The band had stopped traffic for a cover picture of them strolling across the pedestrian crossing naked, save for hats, shoes, and some socks, which were not only on their feet, but dangling elsewhere. Paul wore his Tommy Nutter suit again for a version of the sleeve that was used as the cover of his 1993 album of concert recordings called Paul is Live. The image of Paul with his Old English sheepdog arrow was superimposed over the original 1969 photo with various elements digitally removed, with a wry nod to the preposterous Paul is dead rumors stirred up in 1969. He wears shoes and holds the dog's leash with his left hand. Bare feet and holding a cigarette in his right hand, even though he was left-handed, was seized upon as proof by the mischief makers of 1969. By now, there must be 1 million photos taken by Beatles fans of that ordinary pedestrian crossing. That photo has been called an icon of the 1960s, Ian McMillan reflected. I suppose it is. I would certainly say it is. I would say it's one of the greatest album covers of all time. I think it speaks for itself, how much it's been replicated, how much it's sort of been photographed, how many people go there to take photographs, how much of a kind of a pop culture, how culturally relevant it still is 60 years later. So, Abbey Road, for me, it's my favorite Beatles album, although some have come close as I've started to dig into their catalog more. But I think that medley down the stretch really just seals it for me. Plus, with classic songs like Here Comes the Sun come together. I don't know if it's a perfect album. If I had to grade this, and I did not think about this prior, so this is really live, I'm going to give this a 9.6 out of 10. I think that is, over 9 is an excellent grade. Not a 10 for me, but it's a 9.6. A lot of times, and I think I may have gone over this in past episodes with other guests, which I would highly encourage you checking out. I believe when I've asked the question, if you could take 5 albums to a desert island and only listen to those 5 albums, what are you taking? For me, I want to say Abbey Road probably fits in that mix, but I don't know. That might change on the day, but Abbey Road is definitely, it captures just a certain mood and a certain tone that I think if I was on a desert island, I would want to have access to. So that is my thoughts on Abbey Road. Thank you all for sticking around for this episode of Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. We will be back for episode 50 to review the band Feel's newest album, What of Now, that releases on Friday, August 21st. Going to try and get this episode up by then. No promises, though. So I look forward to going over that, and I look forward to talking with you all soon. Thank you all for tuning in today, and as always, never stop rocking.